From New York to our Bloomberg television and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. This is Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. We're going to start once again with the markets today. Abigail Doodle is here. And Abigail, as I glance at it, it looks like equities are kind of soft going into the end of the week.
Indeed, David. And, you know, we have a confluence of influences, including quadruple witching, which was on the open. That tends to bring some more volatility and typically to the downside as the futures contracts roll. We will also, of course, just have the headline from Governor Andrew Cuomo that new COVID cases here in the state of New York have topped 12,000 for the first time since the pandemic has started. That is certainly does not seem to be constructive news. What's interesting, though, stocks are about as low as they had been ahead of that news. The S&P 500 down about 0.6%. You also have the NASDAQ 100 lower. So we have broad-based selling across the various sectors. In addition, you have the VIX trading higher. So it really is a risk-off day, dragging on the S&P 500, FedEx, along with Apple. Apple also dragging on that NASDAQ 100. But what I'd really like to point out, David, because as you asked the other day, you know, what stands out in terms of really not fitting with the picture, I guess this does fit with the picture, but it exacerbates it. We have the Dow Transports probably rolling over. The last time the Dow Transports put in an all-time high was last week. So over the last several days, down about 2%. This is a concern. Of course, FedEx a drag today on this index. This is a concern because the Dow Transport's a little bit more sensitive to the economy. And this was the index that led back in January around the virus. So super sensitive to the virus. In addition, David, on the week, there's a good news, bad news story. The good news is we have stocks overall higher, the S&P 500, the NASDAQ 100. On the other hand, you have those vaccine makers, Pfizer and Moderna, down sharply on the week for what looks like sell the news as these vaccines. Pfizer's already underway in terms of distribution. It seems as though that will probably be the case for Moderna relatively soon. The big question is, when you put that Dow Transports drop in line together with these vaccine makers dropping, David, does it suggest that there could be some bearish or at least volatile action ahead for stocks? The answer may be yes, but we, of course, are going into the very light holiday weeks ahead. It's going to be interesting, David, as always.
Yeah, as always, exactly, Abigail. At the very least, there are some warning signs there that we have to keep our eyes on. Thanks so much to Abigail Doodle for that report on the markets. Well, we're told that stimulus package is all but certain, but the but is the important word there. Congress is still working on it. And to get a sense of what's taking them so long, we turn now to Libby Cantrell. She's head of public policy for PIMCO. So, Libby, you have the answer. What is taking them so long?
Yeah, well, nice to be with you, David. Well, in some ways, you know, what is old is new again. As we know, congressional negotiators have been discussing another COVID relief bill really since the spring. So fast forward to December, and many of the issues that were obstacles to a deal then are obstacles to a deal now. Most specifically, the level of unemployment insurance, the amount of a rebate check or stimulus check. And now kind of new to the negotiations is this issue around CARES Act funding and these emergency Fed facilities, which are very important to big market participants like PIMCO. So that is now a new issue as well. With all of that said, however, it still looks very likely that we get agreement on this sort of $900 billion-ish deal. Probably before early next week. But as we've seen with Congress, things are taking longer than what they had intended.
Yeah, it's not over till it's over, but as you say, it looks right now like we're going to get it sooner or later, maybe by the end of the weekend. Let's at some point we have to move away from the stimulus bill, as much as we've talked about it for the last 7 months, and talk about the longer term in terms of economic planning. We have President-elect Biden coming into office January 20. Do we have any sense of what his longer-term strategy is? We talked to Bob Casey, the Democratic senator from Pennsylvania, earlier today, and he said that he thinks that there needs to be a really broad approach to the economy overall going past COVID.
Yeah, that's right. And in some ways, the outlook for more fiscal stimulus, for more government spending, really is predicated on those two Georgia races. So January 5th is going to be a very important inflection point in that respect. If Republicans keep those seats, which I think many betting markets are assuming, then we are faced with divided government. Now, we all know that Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden have negotiated big, hard things before. So it's not inconceivable that you do get, a big infrastructure bill, for instance. But it's definitely not as likely under that scenario as it would be if Democrats take back those 2 Georgia races. So I think the bottom line here is that the Biden administration is going to come in January 20th with this sort of economic recovery on top of mind, infrastructure, things to do to stimulate the economy. But again, the prospect of that stimulus will be dependent on those 2 Georgia races and the control of the Senate.
And I wonder if the two subjects are connected in some sense, Libby. Are we seeing sort of a playing out right now in Congress in the stimulus bill of what we might see if, in fact, the Republicans hold on to the Senate? That is to say, Nancy Pelosi started, I think, at $3.3 trillion. We're now down under $900 billion. Still something's going to get done.
Yeah, I think that is. I think that's sort of a nice parallel to draw. Now, I think, as an aside, should Pelosi have taken that 1.5 or $1.8 trillion deal that was on the table back in October, potentially, given that she probably will be taking, less ultimately. But you're right. I do think that there is enough common ground around infrastructure, around, say, drug pricing reform, maybe even immigration, where you could see a Biden-led White House and a McConnell-led Senate actually come to some sort of agreement. I mean, I hope personally, I'm optimistic that you could see that scenario play out. Of course, you could also see just more gridlock, and we have been very familiar with that over the last decade. So again, I can't overstate the importance of those 2 Georgia races, because in some ways those will be really determinative of the path of fiscal policy in particular.
Yeah, and just over 2 weeks away from right now. Thank you so much, Olivia. It's always such a pleasure to have you with us. It's Libby Cantrell. She's head of public policy for PIMCO. Coming up next, we're going to get the view from Capitol Hill about the stimulus, but also about that huge cyber attack from Russia, from Representative French Hill, Republican of Arkansas. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David West, and we go now for Bloomberg First Word News to Karina Mitchell.
But thank you. A live TV audience watched today as Vice President Mike Pence received a coronavirus vaccine shot. The Vice President said he didn't feel a thing. Also being vaccinated were his wife Karen and Surgeon General Jerome Adams. Meanwhile, infectious diseases chief Anthony Fauci tells NBC he hopes a second vaccine will be available by early next week. The Moderna shot was approved by a panel of the FDA's outside advisors. New York has reported more than 12,000 new cases of COVID-19 today. That is the most since the pandemic began. Governor Andrew Cuomo says despite that record, he's confident the state can slow the spread of the virus and avoid a shutdown. The state's previous high number of daily cases reported was in mid-April with about 11,500. And the Pentagon has stopped cooperating with President-elect Joe Biden's transition team. Bloomberg has learned Acting Defense Secretary Christopher Miller has ordered Pentagon officials to stop working with the incoming administration. The Defense Department initially said it was cooperating with the transition with just over a month to go until Biden's inauguration. No official word yet on why the decision was made. And the European Union's chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, is warning British Prime Minister Boris Johnson that he will have to accept limits on access to the single market. Johnson said today, quote, "Our door is open. We'll keep talking."
The UK's position is always that we want to keep talking if there's any chance of a deal. But we've also got to recognise that the UK's got to be able to control its own laws. It's what people voted for, and we've also got to be able to control our waters and our fishing rights. It's obviously also what people voted for.
The fishing industry has a minimal economic impact. It accounts for just 0.1% of UK gross domestic product, but is of high political significance. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Karina Mitchell. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thanks so much, Karina. Well, it's been 7 months in the making, but it looks like we are finally going to get that fiscal stimulus or perhaps COVID spending bill out of Congress. For a report from Capitol Hill, we go now to Republican Congressman French Hill. He represents the state of Arkansas. So welcome, Congressman. Great to have you with us. Happy holidays to you.
Merry Christmas, David. Nice to be with you.
Is it soup yet?
Well, I can smell it. I can smell it in the kitchen. We're not in the den with it in the bowls, but look, on a bipartisan basis on both sides of the Capitol, serious work is being done on COVID-19 relief, something that many of us have advocated for months. And I'm so pleased that Speaker Pelosi has dropped her incredible broad non-pandemic wish list and her dollar expectations that you heard about a few minutes ago of over $3 trillion, and that we're focused on targeted relief that will benefit families, schools, hospitals, governors, and small businesses right now.
Congressman, we've been hearing at the sort of 11th hour, 59th minute about concerns about some of that 13.3, the emergency funding that the Fed had and gave back to the Treasury, also perhaps about FEMA. I understand there's some back and forth, some negotiation going on. Could any of this stop the deal?
You know, in my view, I don't think so. I think our leadership on both sides of the aisle, both sides of the Capitol, are committed to targeted relief for our families. They're crying out for it now. This debate about the Fed funding is an important one, but the Fed has the sufficient resources in the new year with a new administration to take actions that they might need to do in the case of a market liquidity challenge. In the meantime, this CARES Act money was not needed to the extent that we appropriated it. And I think Pat Toomey and Mitch McConnell have done the right thing by proposing to take it back into the Treasury and reallocate it in a much more targeted, needed way, such as rental assistance, extending unemployment compensation, extending the Paycheck Protection Program.
Congressman, I want to turn to another story, I think a very important story that's pending right now, and that is reports of this massive, I think it's fair to say, cyber attack, apparently from Russia, on U.S. and also private computers, state computers back here in the United States. Do we have a sense of how big this is and what the ramifications are?
I think we're just learning how big and pervasive it is, when it started, and the ramifications of it. As the ranking member on the National Security Subcommittee in the House for Financial Services, I'm sure we'll be very involved in evaluating sanctions against those responsible for this, both at the legislative level and reviewing executive sanctions proposed by the Treasury against Russia or a non-state actor that was involved. But let me say this, David, this is something that America plans for in the private sector and the public sector. And we coordinate ably through the FBI on this. So we'll get to the bottom of it, and the people who caused this will pay a price for it.
It appears, Congressman, that some people have been right in saying this is the next frontier of, if I can put it this way, even war, cyber war in a fashion. You've served in senior positions in the Treasury as well as the White House. Do we need to rethink the emphasis we put on this as a government? Do we need to even perhaps restructure the National Security Council or the Department of Homeland Security?
Well, cyber threats are taken seriously by the FBI, by our fusion center that we have that involves the private sector and all the public sector actors, both in defense, homeland security, and in our intelligence agencies. But the emphasis, we need to be asking our colleagues in the executive branch what additional appropriations, what additional powers or legislative changes would be something that would help us even counter cyber threats more so. But I don't want your listeners to view that cyber risk and cyber threats aren't taken seriously by the U.S. government. They have been for years, and they continue to be. We'll see what we learn from this and react accordingly on what we need to do different and do better.
But from your answer to my first question, Congressman, it sounds like you think we definitely need to have, as a tool, retaliation.
We definitely have that as a tool. There's no doubt about that. We have all kinds of ways and means inside our intelligence and defense operations to counter cyber attacks and to counter it in a proactive way.
Right. All right, Congressman, it's always a delight to have you. I hope you have a happy holiday. This is Congressman French Hill, Republican from Arkansas. Next, we get a view from the other side of the aisle of stimulus from Democratic Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, Democrats have been arguing for more fiscal stimulus for months now. And Democratic Senator Bob Casey from Pennsylvania says what they're doing right now, the compromise version, is necessary, but should be seen as an interim step.
We should think of this bill, and I hope most Americans think of it this way, as an interim bill, meaning that it's a January, February, March bill, at least the way I look at it. It's not a 6-month bill, but I think it's essential that we get it done before we leave, and I think that's one thing both sides agree on. But there's just some immediate relief that people need, whether it's unemployment assistance or more help for the small business paycheck protection program, nutrition money, which is brand new and hasn't been part of the negotiation for 7 or 8 months, help for vaccine distribution. So a whole range of issues that need to be addressed, and I think will have to be examined and funded in the month of April as well. And that's not a hard and fast time frame, but I see this as a 3-month interim bill, and there's going to be more work to do.
Well, let's go forward to April, roughly April, and might have to come after that. We don't know what's going to go on with those 2 runoff elections in Georgia yet, which may determine exactly what happens. But does the experience with this compromise, which did grow out of a bipartisan group of senators, give you any hope that even if we have a divided Congress, that is to say, the Republicans continue to control the Senate, you can still move forward with something in April? Or does this really do it if we have a divided Congress?
Well, if the majority is still in Republican hands, it'll be harder to get another COVID-related bill, or relief bill, as I call it, in April. But I don't think it's impossible, but it'll make it much more difficult. And that's, I think that probably carries over into any other economic strategy going forward. But there are some reasons for a sliver of optimism. One is I think the willingness of, as you highlighted, the negotiators to come together on something substantial at a grave time for the nation. That's a good sign that folks are willing to come together, because for most Republicans, since April, when we were doing some consent agreements for a couple $100 billion for this or that, after the big CARES Act at the end of March, most Republicans didn't want to do anything for months. So the fact that they were coming together, I think bodes well. Secondly, the relationship between Leader McConnell and Joe Biden is significant. It's not determinative. It's not a magic wand. It won't work every day. But I do think there will be times when they can reach an agreement or have a breakthrough because of that relationship. I think it's one based upon experience and mutual respect. To a certain extent, respect for the institution of the United States Senate, which should help a little bit. But it's obviously much more difficult now than it was even 10 years ago. But one thing about Joe Biden is I think he will be both persistent and aggressive in trying to make deals. And sometimes he'll reach out his hand and Leader McConnell might bite his hand, or his caucus might, and he might bite it again. And then Joe Biden might have to punch him in the face, figuratively speaking. But he'll keep coming back. I don't think he's going to be insulted and walk away and never engage. He's going to be coming back and try to engage. So we're going to need that. I hope we can get some breakthroughs on an issue, for example, like infrastructure, which is badly needed for the safety and security of the country, but also for the economic jumpstart that it provides in a lot of communities.
Senator, you know so well, having spent a good time in Washington, that some of what a new president does is he initiates, some of it is respond. Right now, even while we're talking about all this, there's a big problem that's lurking in this incredible hack reported by the Russians of government and now private companies' computers as well through the SolarWinds company. Give us a sense of what you make of the size and the scope of that problem, and what both President Trump, who's leaving office, might do about it in the interim, and what President-elect Biden needs to do.
Well, I think I would adopt the language in the approach that President-elect Biden outlined yesterday. He said, and I'm quoting, we should, quote, impose substantial costs, number one. And number two, he said, a good defense is not enough. We need to disrupt and deter, using his words, these kinds of attacks. So I think that's the approach that President Trump should have taken years ago. But unfortunately, I think Vladimir Putin might be the only person that I'm aware of who escaped totally Donald Trump's criticism. He seemed to attack everyone and everything with tweets or with vituperative language. So I think we're paying a price for not having a president who confronts Putin and makes it very clear what the lines are. President-elect Biden's doing the right thing, but I think in terms of what we should do going forward, first of all, the Congress needs to have a briefing, and we haven't had that yet. So I don't have a sense beyond what good journalism is providing me, a sense of the scope. But even from Monday, the number of agencies impacted is growing, it seems, by the day. And as you indicated, it goes beyond government. So I think it's a problem that warrants a thorough, substantial review, and then a determination about what costs we should impose on the bad actor here, which is the Russian Federation.
Does there need to be a restructuring of the government? That is to say, somebody maybe at the cabinet level, somebody at the National Security Council, somebody who really is responsible for cybersecurity to elevate that up the chain in terms of the priorities for the country?
Well, it may be that we do have the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, so-called CISA. We have a director of national intelligence and then all of the relevant agencies. I don't have a good sense yet whether or not that needs to be restructured or adjusted in some fashion. But I think the review, the deep dive that I think is warranted, should yield some answers on that. But at a minimum, we need to know the scope of this attack, the impact of it, and then we have to impose costs. Because if you allow Vladimir Putin to once again go forward without any cost imposed on him or his government, we're just asking for more trouble.
That was Democratic Senator Bob Casey of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Coming up here, we're going to talk with Dr. Atul Gawande. He's from the Harvard Medical School. We're going to talk to him about the vaccine, about the holiday season, and about how the American healthcare system may have been changed forever by this pandemic. And a programming note now, we have Wall Street Week. The next episode coming up tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be joined by Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary, by Laura Tyson, former Chief Economic Advisor to President Clinton, and also the former CEO of IBM, Sam Palmisano, on that cyber attack. That's all coming up on Wall Street Week tonight, 6 o'clock. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Today, the FDA is expected to approve a second vaccine, that one from Moderna, even as tens of thousands of Americans are being vaccinated every day with the first vaccine from Pfizer. We welcome now Dr. Atul Gawande of the Harvard Medical School. He's also a member of President-elect Biden's COVID-19 task force. So, Doctor, thank you so much for being with us. Let's talk about the vaccine just for a bit here. How fast is this going out? We now are getting some reports that some states are being told they're not going to get as many doses as they thought they were going to have. Is there a problem with the distribution with the manufacturer?
Well, on the one hand, I would say, look, we just got approval now of the second vaccine with Moderna, so there is supplies on the way. On the other hand, I think that the administration's predictions that the general public will be getting vaccinated in the spring sounds optimistic from everything that I've seen. These kinds of hiccups are going to be happening, whether it's production, delivery, it's a massive undertaking. And I want to be careful that we're not sending out messages that say that it will all be over by late spring. I think it will clearly take some months longer than that, probably into the fall.
If not entirely over, at what point, in terms of percentage of Americans inoculated, do we get to a point where it really is making a substantial difference in the pandemic? Is it 70%? Is it 80%? I've heard different numbers.
Yeah, and there is no precise number. I think the 70 to 80% is in the right ballpark based on what we know right now. In the next couple months, we will get much more data to learn a critical thing we don't know. The vaccine reduces your likelihood of getting seriously ill with COVID, but is it stopping you from getting an asymptomatic infection, which would be still something you could transmit to others? We'll know that probably by March. But until then, we only know you're less likely to get sick if you get the vaccine, which is hugely important. And in that case, if that's all it does, then you got to get to that 70 to 80% in order to drive this out. If it's stopping transmission entirely, that will help as well.
Understanding there's no precision to this, but if there's a bell curve about when you think we might realistically expect to get to that 70-80%, where would that date be, roughly, in the center of the bell curve?
Well, the biggest drivers right now are going to be two things, and that's going to be production and distribution, as well as the willingness of people to get vaccinated. Assuming production and distribution is, going to take, I think, into the summer, I think we're looking at late summer, early fall to be the more likely timeline that that people can count on. Is it possible it happens faster than that? Absolutely, but that is not what I would bet the farm on.
So you were such a specialist in public health, doctor. Give us some guidance here about what do we do to get to that point. I mean, we had Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, just today, earlier today, say that we now set a new record for one-day increase of cases of 12,000 in New York. And we're seeing this in California, we're seeing around the country. What do we do in the meantime?
Yeah, I think it's so important to understand that right now the epidemic is worse than it's ever been. As of the last week, COVID-19 is now the #1 killer in the country. We have more deaths per day than from heart disease or any other category of illness. So, and this is getting worse. As we head into the holidays, we're seeing the possibility of what Dr. Fauci called surge upon surge, right? People got together over Thanksgiving. Now we're going to have that happen at Christmas. We already know we're going to cross the 400,000 death point based on the number of infections happening now. Millions of people, 1 in 100 people tested positive in the last 2 weeks, meaning a massive amount of active infection that's still out there. So what do we do? The critical steps are the ones we've known from the very beginning. It's taking seriously, wearing our masks, maintaining social distancing, being restrictive about those we get together with outside of our household. And when we do get together with others outside the household, absolutely maintaining that distancing. And when we can, get testing to be sure that that we're not getting infected ourselves. It really is those basics. And our behavior drives it down. Now, the big issues are indoor gatherings, especially where people are eating and drinking and therefore taking off their masks. It's a small percent of the population that's driving much of the behavior, around 20%, who are not wearing masks, getting together with larger groups of people, but they are keeping this infection going, and we got to get to where we're 90% doing the right thing and better.
Dr. Gawande, as you've pointed out, we have a ways to go, and we have a lot of work to do to get to that point. You are a member of President-elect Biden's COVID-19 task force. Beyond the COVID-19 issue, give us a sense of what this pandemic might do to our healthcare system that could be positive. Are there things that we're learning about our healthcare system, about what we can do from this pandemic that maybe we would not have learned, or at least not have learned as quickly?
Well, I'll give you 2 dramatic changes. People have talked about the transformation of healthcare to be much more virtual, accessing telemedicine. Most of your viewers at this point have had a medical interaction now that's through this medium or via the phone, and it's proving to be highly successful, convenient, and enables people to get very good care. There are certainly lots of situations where you got to be face-to-face with the patient to get to understand what's going on. But then the next step that's happened just before Thanksgiving, the Medicare approved being able to even provide hospital care in the home. That is acute care for whether it's illnesses like congestive heart failure, pneumonia, and others. My own hospital, the Brigham and Women's Hospital, we have been deploying hospital at home care where you take people from the emergency room who would have been admitted and we send them home. And we have found that it is not only safe, the patients do better. They have less likelihood of bouncing back into the emergency room. They're walking 300 steps a day instead of only 30 steps a day while they're in the hospital. They are also, the care is costing 20% less, and savings can be even larger than that. So that transformation to moving hospital care into the home is a big deal. And then we're already seeing with the approval of at-home testing for COVID, and that trend is going to continue where diagnostic testing will become something relatively rapidly that is going to become widely more available at home, not just for this virus, but for many other viruses and bacterial infections and other conditions. So that's a silver lining here, that we're learning how to finally move out of all of the giant places that you have to travel to for 15-minute visits and understand that it's deploying the right care in the right place at the right time for people where it works best.
Doctor, really appreciate your being with us today. It was a treat having you. That's Dr. Atul Gawande. He is from the Harvard Medical School, as well as a member of the President-elect Biden's COVID-19 task force. Coming up next, we're going to get a view on the stimulus from the White House from Joe Livornia. He's the chief economist for the National Economic Council. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. There was a big story out today from the Commerce Department as they added some more Chinese companies, some semiconductor companies, to their blacklist. For a full report, we turn to our colleague now, Michael McKee. He is international economics and policy correspondent here at Bloomberg. So, Mike, what's going on here? Is this just more of the same?
It's a little bit more of the same, and it's an expansion of the Trump administration's policies towards China and the idea that they think China is a geopolitical threat to the United States. The Commerce Department has added Semiconductor Manufacturing Incorporated to the so-called entities list, which means that, excuse me, any American company that wants to sell to them has to get a license, and sort of by definition, that license is going to be denied. The idea is to keep highly sensitive, highly advanced technology and the equipment to make that technology out of the hands of the Chinese.
Okay, Michael, I really appreciate you joining us. That's Michael McKee, Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. We're going to go to the White House and Joe Livornia, who is the chief economist for the National Economic Council. Thank you for joining us, Joy. I really want to talk to you about the stimulus, but let's pick up for a moment on this story about the China companies. We've got a lot of issues going on in cyberspace right now with the Russian attack apparently on U.S. computers, as well as now some more companies being blacklisted. From an economist's point of view, which is what you are, from an economist's point of view, what are the ramifications for the U.S. economy if we can't really protect our computer systems?
Thank you, David, for having me on. Certainly, as you said, it's very important economically. Economics is all about confidence, so you have to have confidence in the system. Ambassador O'Brien, who heads the NEC, the National Security Council, in fact, cut his European trip short because of this. And as Michael had said earlier, our administration has taken action against parties that pursued these sort of illicit actions, these improper illegal actions. So it's something that's obviously very, we take very seriously, and we're on top of the case. And obviously, going forward, cybersecurity is something that we have to deal with, not just, as you know, publicly and for security purposes, but obviously at the corporate level as well, where you've had various breaches over the years. So it's a concern. It's an ongoing concern. It's something we're going to keep dealing with.
Well, and on the economic side, as I understand it, from what we know right now, this is sort of a supply chain problem. There's this company called SolarWinds, and obviously the U.S. government relies upon a lot of private contractors. How difficult is it going to be as an economic matter to sort of disentangle or protect some of our supply chains?
Right now, David, I wouldn't worry so much about that. I mean, the bigger issue, obviously, is the coronavirus and the fact that a lot of factories were shut down in the spring. They couldn't work because of restrictions due to the virus, and thankfully the therapeutics have gotten better and the vaccines have been coming out, and that's going to help on the supply chain front. But this is something, having spent most of my career in the private sector, many companies take cybersecurity very seriously, and it's something my guess is that budgets will continue to increase. I can tell you when we look at the capital spending numbers, and certainly computers, intellectual property, software, all those sorts of things that would be related to cybersecurity, when you see those numbers, certainly see a big increase, and that will, for better or for worse, that'll be an area of growth going forward.
Thank you so much for addressing it. But now let's go back to stimulus, if we could, Joe. Give us a sense of what you think is going on on Capitol Hill, and what's the White House's role in this and position on what's being discussed?
I mean, we've thought all along, David, that the economy would benefit from extra assistance. Wasn't that we wouldn't get a V-shaped recovery, because I believe the data have borne that forecast out. That optimistic forecast that we spoke of earlier in the year has certainly played out. But there's certainly still a lot of pain and hardship in the economy. There's certainly people who need more help. We're optimistic that this latest version of the talks will give more money to the payroll protection plan. We'll get a federal plus up, we hope, of $300 on employment insurance, as well as direct mail checks. So I'm hopeful the stimulus is forthcoming and soon. The financial markets are expecting it. People need it. It's the right thing to do. There's bipartisan support. It'll be a good Christmas gift, hopefully, for some, a good holiday gift, because we have to do more.
Again, as an economist, give us some sense of what you might project about the practical effects. We've seen some weak retail numbers last week, actually, and we've also seen some weakening in the labor. Given the nature of what's being discussed as this compromise stimulus, how is it likely to help employment and retail sales spending, frankly?
To me, it's going to help people who need to. You know, the PPP has been extraordinarily successful. We estimated, David, that it might have saved upwards of 50 million jobs. So the additional funding is going to keep people on the payroll. That's going to help. And there's certainly people who are struggling to meet their rent or mortgage payments. So to the extent they can get some extra assistance to get them over this difficult time, that's going to be good. If the economy suffers at all, David, this month and next, and I would still argue it's debatable how much it's slowing, because some of it's coming off of a high level. That, to me, is more the result of these various coronavirus restrictions. In the case of California, California's GDP accounts for about 15% of overall U.S. GDP, and they have a shelter-in-place order for the state. So that, to me, is probably potentially a bigger hit on the economy, but it's temporary. It's not long-term by any means. But that's the decision that state's making to do in the safety of their citizens, for better or for worse. And at least in the short term, if we can help give people extra monies to get them through this difficult time before the vaccine becomes more widely distributed. And by the way, David, we could see possibly upwards of 100 million vaccinations given by as soon as early March. So that's going to help. And the fiscal stimulus, or fiscal assistance rather, is an extra layer of protection. It's an insurance policy.
Yeah, Joe, that's a really helpful perspective on the economy and how it relates to COVID and the vaccine as well. Thank you so much. That's Joe Livornia. He is the chief economist for the National Economic Council at the White House. Meantime, coming up here, we're looking forward to those runoff elections, 2 of them for the Senate in Georgia, just over 2 weeks away right now. We're going to talk with a Democratic congressman from the state of Georgia. He is Hank Johnson, comes from just east of Atlanta. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I'm David Weston. We have 2 Senate runoff elections coming up in Georgia just over 2 weeks from now, right now. We're joined now by a Democratic congressman from the state of Georgia. He is Hank Johnson. Hank, thank you so much very much for being us. Mr. Congressman, what does it look like right now? The reports we're getting is basically a dead heat on both races. Is that your take?
Well, I tell you, the voters are activated in Georgia. There's a lot of energy on the ground among Democrats. There is just an acute knowledge of how important this January 5th election is, not just to Georgia, but to the nation. And I think that the citizens of Georgia are rising to the occasion. I was looking at the early voting totals for Georgia on Monday, for Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday's total votes. I haven't seen yesterday's total votes, but I'm very impressed with the fact that the first 3 days of early voting in Georgia, each day, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, there were more votes cast on each day than on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of the first week of early voting for the general election. And the general election vote tallies were really off the chain. I remember how astounding those totals were. And it really gave me confidence that Georgia was going to turn blue for Biden and Harris. And those numbers continued to be impressive during those 3 weeks of early voting. And sure enough, Georgians voted in record numbers, and we turned Georgia blue on November 3rd. And I'm looking for the same thing to happen on January 5th.
Let's go back to your home district there, DeKalb County, as I understand it. Insofar as people are turning out to vote, and the numbers you suggest, what's driving them? I mean, I understand the Senate hangs in the balance, but that's a little bit abstract. What in their lives is saying, my life will be better if I turn out to vote?
Well, this economic crisis that has been caused by the mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic has wreaked havoc on households in my district and throughout Georgia. The lines for people needing food assistance are longer than in memory, and people are driving up in nice cars that they were once able to afford, and they're doing everything they can to retain because they need their cars to get around to find work. And so people in nice cars driving up to get food handouts. There's just so many people who are food insecure, and they have seen what has happened over the last 10 months with Congress having passed the CARES Act, which was a good thing for people. It really kept people from falling through the cracks. And they've seen, since the CARES Act passed about 9 months ago, they've seen the HEROES Act pass in May. They have seen Mitch McConnell do nothing with that legislation. They have seen Republicans now saying that they don't think direct payments to people who are really hurting are the right thing to do. They recognize the difference between the two parties. They recognize that if Democrats control the Senate, we will get Mitch McConnell out of there, and then we have a chance of getting some direct cash payments to people, extending their unemployment, stabilizing their health care, making sure that people get the kind of vaccine that they need, make sure that the vaccine is distributed in a way that is equitable and fair and free, and that's why people are turning out.
Yeah, Congressman, that brings us actually to the stimulus package. Just briefly here at the end, I understand it's not all that was in the HEROES Act, but how will it help some of those issues if this does get done this weekend as it's expected?
Well, people are looking for a lifeline at this point, and they know what has happened in the past, and they know what is bound to happen in the future if Mitch McConnell retains control of the Senate. And so people really want Congress to pass coronavirus relief legislation. They really want a direct cash payment. It's an emergency payment to stabilize people, stabilize families. They need a reimposition of the eviction moratorium. They need protection when it comes to their utilities being shut off, and things are dire for people. So they need us, and they want us to pass this coronavirus package and do.
A lot of people hurting as we go to the holidays. Thank you so much to Hank Johnson. He's Democratic Congressman from Georgia, and this is Bloomberg.